Guys, finally, we have time to talk about one last thing, and that is Ambassador Katherine Tai's op-ed in the Financial Times, where she argues that economic policy should work on behalf of working people rather than in service of trickle-down economies and deferring to the wisdom of markets. She put an emphasis on a new social contract. What does this all mean in practice?
I think we both have a rant on that, but I'm going to let Scott go first.
Well, I read this op-ed with great interest and wondered if Ambassador Tai had borrowed Senator Warren's speechwriter, or perhaps the AI she used was trained by Senator Warren's speechwriter. It was a classic progressive speech of fuzzy aspirations, but I couldn't actually find a concrete policy direction anywhere from it. Now, look, I want to support working people, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics said last month that there were over 140 million Americans in their employment survey. So there are a lot of working Americans. I have no working people. I have no idea who she means. Does she include tech workers? Does she include farmers? Does she include people who make their living providing services with imported goods? I just don't know who she means by that. I know what that catchphrase means if it were spoken by a union leader, as it's familiar language in that context. But as a matter of American policy, I don't know what it means. I don't know what she has in mind when she wants to configure or reconfigure the American economy. And she talks about economic opportunities and economic justice. And certainly there are parts of trade policy which are about fairness, things like non-discrimination, most favored nation treatment. So it's part of her policy toolkit. But frankly, the examples are all after the fact. The only way we know that something is part of her preferred policy is to look at it after it's been implemented. I couldn't find anything that she proposed as part of a practical agenda that would accomplish what she wanted. Look, in my mind, the U.S. Trade Representative has one of the most pragmatic jobs in the cabinet. He or she negotiates trade agreements, principally. Most of them see their job as removing barriers to U.S. exports of goods and services, to making fairer treatment for American firms in international commerce. There's none of that here, so I'm not sure what to make of it.
Here comes Bill's rant.
Well, I can tell you which workers she's talking about. She's talking about union workers in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
That's what I was afraid of.
That's who it's about. I happen to agree with her on the first half. In fact, for those of you out there who also read my column, I think I wrote about this either last week or the week before. They all kind of blur together after a while. I think what we've learned is that trickle down doesn't really work in the U.S. economy, and that when President Kennedy was talking about economic policies, he said a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think what we've learned from globalization is that it doesn't lift all boats. It lifts the yachts of the rich people, but it doesn't lift the boats of the poor people. So I think they're on to a legitimate problem where I disagree with them and agree with Scott. I don't think they've developed a coherent response to how to deal with that. I mean, to me, the mistake from the beginning has been to assume that you can address social inequities and economic inequality entirely through trade agreements. And my view from the beginning has been that the agreements create benefits. They create more growth. They create more trade. They create more exports. There's also more imports coming in. How we distribute the benefits are really determined by other kinds of government policy. If you want to use a trade agreement to redistribute benefits, which is what she talks about, you can try to do that through rules of origin that are discriminatory, basically, and force, as what we did with USMCA autos, would force value added to take place in specified locations in order to be eligible for whatever trade agreement benefits are available. That's just a small part of the total picture. And of course, it also ignores, as Scott said, that American workers are a diverse community. There are a lot of people, yes, they make steel, they make cars, they make a whole bunch of manufacturing equipment, but there's a much larger number of workers in the services industry. And there are professionals, and there's a lot of people who, even the ones that are making all those manufactured parts, they're making from imported components. So if you are Boeing, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers at various stages of your supply chain. And many of those stages are foreign. And so you've got American workers here making money, putting together parts, assembling parts that have come in from all kinds of places, Mexico, Canada, China in some cases, and elsewhere. And they're put together here, and then eventually they end up in an airplane. Those workers don't seem to be on the list of people that we're worried about. We seem to be worried just about a smaller group of workers. But I guess what frustrated me about the whole thing is that there isn't really a coherent plan for how to fix that. I mean, they've been very clear about what they're not going to do. They're not going to negotiate trade agreements that involve giving other people more market access. What that means in practice is you're not going to negotiate trade agreements, because if we have nothing to give, then nobody else is going to give us anything. And that's played out in the IPEF. It's modest at best, and the trade pillar is in purgatory or limbo, depending upon how you want to view these things. So I think on the whole, it's been a disappointment. But I have to say that I think the initial thought that agreements historically have been based on the idea that if you benefit big companies, it'll all trickle down to the workers. I think that's pretty much proven to be not true. But they really haven't come up with a solution to that.
Well, look, nobody ever mentions growth, which is, for me, the topic that's most important over the long haul. Open markets grow faster than closed. That's well known. But if you look at just the U.S. economy, since the turn of the century, we've grown at about 2% a year on average. Real economic growth. Okay. We chose an economic strategy and economic policies that have led to 2% growth. Had we chosen policies that would have led to an average 3% growth, every American would be $18,000 better off in their per capita income.
I could use another 18 grand.
I could too, because the reason I put the number out is because that means a lot of people who are relatively poor are richer. Okay.
Sure.
One of the ways you help poor people is let them get rich. Okay. And so the obsession with chief executive salaries and this big business thing is a complete misdirection of what really can be done with economic policy to generate growth that is broadly available to people. And as you put it, Bill, if you've got an extra $18,000 per capita to work with, you could do a lot with social policy. You could do a lot with health policy. There's a lot of options you have as an elected official you don't have if people are $18,000 poorer. So for me, they missed the boat entirely. And as a result, I don't think it resonates.
I don't agree with you on the executive salaries. If you've got workers making $40,000 or $50,000 and the CEO is making $15 million, counting his stock options, I'm not sympathetic.
And I don't think anyone's asking for sympathy, but I'm suggesting it misses the point from a policy standpoint. You ought to have a pro-growth policy and make poor people richer.